Have you ever really, stopped and thought beyond just the usual biology class stuff about where we come from? Us as thinking, self-aware beings.
It's a deep one, isn't it? What ancient traditions might say about let's call it the non-physical part of our origins.
Exactly. What are the other ingredients that make us, well, us? That's what we're getting into.
It really hints that our story might be a lot more layered than just physical evolution.
Totally. And our source for this dive is honestly pretty fascinating. We're digging into excerpts from H.P. Blavatsky's huge work, The Secret Doctrine.
Specifically, we're zooming in on stanza 3 of Anthropogenesis. It deals with the early attempts to actually create humanity.
Yeah, and our mission really is to unpack this core idea she presents, that humanity wasn't just, poof, created in one go by one being.
No, it was more like a complex dual process. That's the key term here, involving different kinds of divine beings, different forces.
Leading to our sort of composite nature, that mix of things that makes us human.
Right. And what's interesting is how this theosophical view, as we explore it, seems to echo in other traditions too. You'll see some surprising parallels.
So we're going to try and break down these big ideas, connect the dots, maybe have a few moments where you go, huh, never thought of it that way. So you wanted to get into these deeper origins. Let's do it.
Okay, let's start by setting the scene. The cosmic stage, if you will. The source talks about a time after some kind of purification, a new world is being prepped.
Right. And there's a main figure, a lord of the lords.
Yes, a chief creative intelligence. And this being separates the waters from heaven, setting up the first organized realm, the firmament.
Yeah, these waters.
There.
We're not talking about literal oceans, are we? Feels bigger than that.
No, exactly. The text makes it clear. Waters here symbolize that primordial, sort of chaotic, undifferentiated cosmic stuff. Potential waiting for form, prakriti in some traditions.
And heaven is like the first structure imposed on that chaos, the first organized planes.
That's the idea, bringing order out of the void. And the source itself points out, hey, this isn't some totally unique image.
Like in the Puranas.
Yeah, like Brahma as the boar lifting the earth from the waters, or, Genesis, the firmament in the midst of the waters, dry land appearing.
So it's a common theme, this idea of separating, organizing, making space for creation.
It suggests maybe a shared, ancient understanding of how things get started, cosmically speaking.
Okay, so the stage is set. The world is kind of ready.
Mm-hmm.
What's the next step towards making us?
Well, a command goes out. It's directed at a specific group of creative beings.
Who are they?
They're called Great Chohans, but more specifically for our story, the Lords of the Moon. And the command is pretty direct. Bring forth men of your nature.
Lords of the Moon. That's evocative. What does that mean in this context? Who are they?
They're also called the Lunar Pitris. According to this teaching, they're beings who finish their evolution on a previous planetary chain, the moon chain, essentially.
Okay, so they're connected to the moon, evolutionarily speaking.
Right. And they're described as having airy bodies, so still quite subtle, more astral than physical.
And their job in creating humans is very specific.
Very specific and absolutely crucial. They're told to give the jivas, the spiritual sparks or monads, their forms within.
Forms within. So like the template, the blueprint.
Exactly. The astral blueprint, the subtle body, the shaya. It's the non-physical mold that the physical body will eventually be built around.
Okay, so the inner pattern comes from these lunar guys. What about the outer physical part?
That's where Earth comes in. The command continues. She, Mother Earth or nature, will build coverings without.
Ah, so nature takes the blueprint from the lunar pitris and builds the physical body using earthly materials.
That's the partnership described. Inner form from the moon lords, outer substance from Earth.
And the text mentions these earliest forms were males, females.
Yeah, that's hinting at the idea of early humanity being androgynous before the separation of sexes, which theosophy teaches happened over long ages through different root races.
Got it. And there's another group mentioned, the Lords of the Flame. They're there too.
They are present, yes, but distinct. And this distinction between the Lords of the Moon and the Lords of the Flame, well, that becomes the absolute crux of the whole story of our dual nature.
Okay, so this is where things get complicated because not everyone followed that initial command to create, right?
Exactly right. The source talks about a great schism, a split among these divine creators.
What happened?
Well, one group associated with the moon gods, they went ahead. They started creating in their assigned zones, laying the foundation for the different human types or races.
Okay, they obeyed. But the other group, the Lords of the Flame.
They remained behind. The text says they would not go, would not create.
It sounds rebellious, like they refused the job.
Well, that's how it often looks in the surface stories, the exoteric myths. The source even gives the Hindu names, the Barhishad Pitras and the Agnishwatta Pitras. The Barhishad are linked to certain kinds of ritual fire and ancestry. The Agnishwatta, interestingly, are sometimes described as being without that kind of fire, or without desire. But Blavatsky offers an esoteric key here.
Ah, so there's a deeper meaning to their refusal.
Very much so. The source explains that the Agnishwatta, the Lords of the Flame, are actually a higher class of beings, more spiritual solar divas, sometimes called Manasaputras.
Manasaputras, meaning sons of mind.
And the reason they refused to create physically wasn't sin or rebellion. It was about their fundamental nature.
How so?
They were, as the text quoted say, too divine and pure. They lacked the necessary gross fire or creative passion needed for physical generation at that stage. They were beings of pure intellect, pure spirit.
So they just weren't equipped for that specific task of making physical forms.
Precisely. They couldn't project a physical astral shadow like the lunar Pitras could. Their fire was the fire of higher consciousness, of mind, not the fire of physical creation. They were, you could say, overqualified for that particular job.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they held back. And the other group, the Barhishad.
They were equipped as the lunar spirits evolved on the more material moon chain. They were closer to the principles needed to provide that astral model, that basic mold. The source calls them the creative Elohim of form, the atom of dust.
So the Barhishad provide the dust, the potential form, the blueprint. But the Agnishwatta, the sons of mind, couldn't play that role.
Correct. And this is why interpreting the refusal is so important. When myths portray them as rebels or yogis who wouldn't create, or even asuras,
Yeah.
the esoteric view is that it wasn't rebellion, but wisdom. They were waiting for the forms created by the Barhishad to evolve enough to be ready for something else.
Ready for what?
Ready for the spark of self-conscious mind, a gift that only they, the Agnishwatta, the sons of mind, could provide.
Okay. This leads us right into the mechanics of how this dual creation actually worked then. So Barhishad did their part. They created what exactly?
They created the outer man, or at least the model for it, the astral form, the chacha. But the description is pretty stark. These early forms were aeriform, devoid of compactness, and mindless.
Mindless. There's that word again. That really feels like the key missing piece, doesn't it?
It's absolutely the key. This early human form, made by the lunar Pitras, had no manas, no principle of mind. It was just a shape, a vessel. The source says it had no middle principle.
Middle principle, meaning?
Meaning nothing to connect the highest spiritual core, the monad, the Atma Buddhi, with the lowest vehicle, the physical body and brain that nature was slowly building.
So the divine spark, the monad, was there inside these forms, but it couldn't connect. It couldn't express itself, like a light bulb not plugged in.
That's a great way to put it. The source says the monads were in these shells, but they were unconscious on these lower planes. They couldn't achieve self-awareness through these senseless models. These were the early root races, functioning more on instinct.
Okay, enter the Agnishwatta, the ones who initially held back. This is their moment.
This is their crucial role. The text says they sacrificed themselves to complete humanity, to make the septenary man the seven-principled human being.
And what exactly did they add? What was missing?
Two main connecting principles were needed to bridge the gap between the spiritual monad, the higher triad, and the lower form, the lower quaternary.
Which were?
Manas, the self-conscious thinking mind, the ego, the fifth principle, and kama, the principle of desire and will, which animates the lower personality, the fourth principle. These link the higher and lower.
Manas. That's the big one, right? Self-awareness, the thinking eye.
That's the game changer. And providing manas required what the source calls a living spiritual fire, the fire of self-consciousness, of independent thought.
And this fire wasn't something the Barhishad, the form builders, had.
Not in the same active, self-aware way. The source uses symbols here. It talks about the Agnishwatta as triangles, representing active fire and intellect, versus cubes, symbolizing the more passive form-building forces. The Agnishwatta embodied this intellectual fire. It's compared to Prometheus bringing fire to humanity. It's this fire of independent thought that made them active, free intelligences, not just passive obeyers of cosmic law.
So their earlier refusal was actually tied to their destiny as the bringers of mind and free will.
That's the esoteric interpretation, yes. Their unique nature, possessing this fire of manas, made them the only ones who could complete the job, who had turned that mindless form into a thinking, self-aware human.
Wow. So the yinker is that thinks and feels and reflects. It's not just an emergent property of the physical brain, according to this.
Not solely, no. The source is quite specific. The real human ego, the part that reincarnates, the self-conscious I, isn't just the ultimate spirit, Atma, or the spiritual soul, Buddhi alone. It is the higher manas, acting as the vehicle for them on our plane. It's the principle of intellectual self-conscious egotism in a higher sense.
And then Agnishwatta, these flames.
Their destiny, their sacrifice, was to incarnate as these very egos within humanity. They literally provided the mind spark that lit up the forms prepared by the others.
The source talks about an impassable abyss between human mentality and animal instinct, right? Even if the core spark is the same.
Yes, and that abyss is manas. It's the principle of self-conscious mind that elevates humanity, connecting the animal form to divine awareness.
So the picture we get is, man isn't just an animal who got smart.
According to this teaching, no. Man is fundamentally dual. In the source's words, an animal plus a living God within his physical shell. An earthly form animated by a divine thinking ego from a higher source.
That's a lot to take in, a truly dual nature. And the source argues this isn't some weird, isolated idea found only in theosophy.
Right. It insists that you can find traces, hints, echoes of this dual creation everywhere if you know how to look.
We mentioned Genesis and the Puranas briefly. What about Paul's words in the New Testament?
Yeah, 1 Corinthians. The first man is of the earth, earthy. The second man is the Lord from heaven.
How does that fit?
Well, the theosophical reading sees the first man as that physical form, built from earth by the lower lunar creators, the Barhishad, earthy.
And the second man?
That's the spiritual ego, the manas principle, coming from heaven, from the higher solar, mind-born beings, the Agnishwatta.
Interesting. And you mentioned earlier connections made to Jehovah and the moon.
Yes, the source dives into Kabbalistic ideas, linking Jehovah, often seen collectively as the Elohim, with these lunar pitris, the lords of the moon. It points to things like the importance of the lunar calendar in Hebrew tradition.
Are there specific examples in the text?
Oh, yeah. It mentions Paul talking about observing the new moon. It connects Mount Sinai with the mountain of the moon. It even gets into the numerical value of names like Hagar, linking it to lunar cycles, and Sarai becoming Sarah, gaining lunar symbolism.
Wow, okay.
The argument is that esoterically, the figure of Jehovah often represented these generative lunar forces aligning with the role of the Barhishad, the form builders.
So that covers the earthy form-giving side in other traditions. What about the heavenly mind-giving side, the Agnishwatta equivalents?
For that, the source looks again to Aryan myths, specifically the stories of the rebellious sons of Brahma figures like the Kumaras or the Rishi Narada.
How are they rebellious?
They refused to engage in purely physical procreation. They chose asceticism, spiritual pursuits. Narada even actively discouraged procreation in others.
And there was a consequence for Narada.
Yes, he was cursed to be reborn as a man, which, in this reading, reinforces the Agnishwatta archetype. Higher intellectual beings whose destiny or karma involved incarnating into humanity to provide mind. Narada is seen as one of these mind givers appearing across ages.
Does the Kabbalah have similar fiery creators?
It does. The source references the Book of the Concealed Mystery, talking about vibrating flames and sparks involved in man's creation. Sounds a lot like the Lords of the Flame, doesn't it?
It really does.
And then there's the Zohar's idea of pre-Adamite kings.
What were they?
They were like preliminary sketches of humanity, races that could not exist and were overthrown because the proper conditions weren't ready.
That sounds uncannily like the early mindless root races, the Chayas we talked about earlier.
Exactly the connection the source makes. These were the imperfect, mindless forms that had to be set aside until the vehicle was right. And this readiness is symbolized by the holy city not being prepared.
What's the holy city symbolizing there?
It's interpreted as the perfected physical vehicle needed for proper human procreation, specifically the womb, the earthly matrix reflecting the heavenly one. Until that was ready, the higher mind couldn't fully take root or propagate itself properly.
So looking across these different traditions, Hebrew, Aryan, Kabbalistic,
the source argues that the underlying principles are the same. The Elohim, the sparks, the cherubs on one side, the devas, rishis, fires, flames on the other, they map onto the same dual functions of form-giving and mind-giving. It sees this as strong evidence for a universal, ancient doctrine hidden beneath different symbols.
Okay, let's try and wrap our heads around the core idea from this deep dive then. Humanity, as we understand ourselves, wasn't a one-shot deal.
Definitely not, according to this view. It was a partnership, a dual creation.
You had the form givers first.
The lunar Pitris, the Barhashad, they provided the astral mold, the blueprint, the lower principles connecting us to the physical world, the earthy part.
And then came the mind givers.
The solar devas, the Agnishwatta, the sons of mind. Through their sacrifice, their incarnation, they provided the spark of manas, self-consciousness, the heavenly part that bridges the gap between animal form and divine spirit.
And it was this second group, the Agnishwatta, that really made the difference.
Absolutely crucial. They're the ones credited with turning the senseless model into a thinking, self-aware being, making humanity, as the source puts it, almost a divine being, a god on earth.
So if we take this view seriously, it means that you, listening right now, are this blend. An earthly vehicle shaped by one set of forces.
And sold by a spark of independent, divine intelligence, gifted by a completely different, higher order of beings.
It's a radical reframing of what it means to be human.
It really is. It challenges a purely material view completely.
And it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to chew on, doesn't it? If our self-conscious mind, our sense of I, comes from beings whose defining act was, in a sense, a rebellion against passive creation, a choice for active intellect.
Yeah. What does that say about our nature, about free will? Is there an inherent spark of that rebellious intellect, that drive for independent thought baked into our consciousness?
Or maybe thinking about ourselves as this mix of earth and fire, animal and God.
Yeah.
How does that change how we view consciousness itself, its struggles, its potential?
Definitely something to ponder. It adds a whole other dimension to the human experience.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for going on this fascinating and pretty complex deep dive with us today.